Welcome back to the High Ticket Woman. I'm Debbie Cottle, your host, and I'm so glad you're here with me today because this episode is going to be so much fun. Today, I'm going to talk about something I've referenced before, but I never really spent a lot of time on. We're going to talk about butterflies and buffalo. Essentially, the male and female differences that, sometimes drive us crazy about each other. This is such an important conversation because marriage isn't just about love. Like, we can get really wrapped up on, like, feeling in love and romantic love and, passion, but so much of a healthy marriage is about learning to understand each other. And so, our anchor scripture today that all of this is built on is in 1 Peter 3:7. And that says, "Husbands, love your wives and live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you in the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." Now, I want to jump back to that phrase, weaker vessel, because sometimes that's so misunderstood, right? Or even misused, right? Weaker vessel doesn't mean inferior. It doesn't mean less capable. It's actually a reference to something delicate, valuable, and of high worth, right? Or we could say high ticket, right? So that weaker vessel needs to be handled with intentional care. So I don't know if you realize this, but in biblical times, people they used pots and pitchers and containers, often made from clay, right? And they had everyday items that they used, right? Some were for really hard labor and constant use. So they were thicker and heavier and more durable. And they could be tossed around, or scrubbed clean or, however they were being used. And they wouldn't crack under pressure. But those weaker vessels, okay, this is the actual original, this is the meaning of the word weaker vessel when you go back to the Greek. Okay, those vessels weren't weak in value. In fact, they were often more expensive and reserved for special occasions, like our modern day really delicate china. So dishes back then or vessels back then that were very ornately designed, and they'd be brought out for special occasions, maybe to serve honored guests. You definitely didn't toss them around, right? You carried them very carefully. You treated those vessels with honor because they were precious. They were worth, they had more value than those everyday usage vessels, right? So, when Peter writes that husbands should love their wives and live with them in an understanding way, showing honor to them as the weaker vessel, he's not saying women are fragile or inferior or weaker. He's saying handle her with care, treat her with intentionality, recognize her value, and treat her accordingly. And that's where we begin today. Okay, with that understanding that those male and female differences are not deficits. They are really a divine design, right? God designed us so differently. So let's talk about what it means to, I mean, I've talked about this before in some other episodes, but today we're really going to dive in and using these metaphors, right? Because I want you to understand some of the key differences between how men and women are wired and how that wiring can become an absolute gift instead of a war zone, right? But we're gonna look at it through this metaphorical lens of the butterfly and the buffalo. So, what do you think of when you think of a butterfly? We're not talking about stereotypes here, by the way, okay? There are some I'm talking about, um, ways to view men and women that help us understand these differences. And certainly there are exceptions to this rule, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But when you think about a butterfly, what do you think about, right? I mean, the first thing that I think about is that she's small, and delicate and beautiful. I mean, butterflies come in all different colors, and I mean, their wings are luminescent. They are just beautiful, delicate creatures, but they are also very sensitive to their environment, aren't they? Right? So, just like a butterfly, a woman's beauty is paired with vulnerability, right? A butterfly is sensitive and yet still powerful, but that sensitivity can also become very overwhelming for us, right? If we're not handled with that gentleness, then, there's gonna be problems. Imagine if you take a single little pebble. I use this example a lot when I talk with women that I work with in my program. If you take a single pebble and you place it on that delicate wing, what's gonna happen? She's not gonna be able to fly, right? That's how attuned and affected she is by even the slightest pressure or the slightest emotional shift in her environment. Another really key thing about the butterfly is that she's aerial. She hovers above, doesn't she? And she's looking at life from this broader perspective. She picks up on subtle cues when it comes to communication and tone changes and energy shifts, things that the buffalo might miss entirely. And her perspective is it's a combination of being very emotional, but also intuitive and very layered, and we're gonna talk about that here more in a second. Butterflies move very gracefully, don't they? But not always predictably, right? They flit. Butterflies flit here and there, right? They're not consistent in their movement, and I know this can drive men crazy, but butterflies are moved by beauty, and they thrive, again, now thinking about women, they thrive in in emotional connection, right? Women are very relational. It's why we as women, when we get together with other women, we're talking about relationships. We're talking about our husbands and our children and, our friends. And sometimes this creates a problem for us, right? This is why we can become known as gossipers, because it is so tempting for us to talk about people because we are so relational. And here's the thing about butterflies, we don't need fixing. There's nothing wrong with us as we are, in terms of our female characteristics. We just need to be understood. But by the same token, now we talk about buffalo, we talk about men, right? They also need to be understood. So what do you think about when you think about buffalo? Well, I used to live in Wyoming. I lived there for 19 years, and Wyoming is a place where you can still see buffalo. And when I look at the buffalo, I see a magnificent, majestic creature. I also see strength. And buffalo isn't a creature that I want to walk up to and say, "Hey, you're so cute. Let me pet you," right? No, I respect that solidness and the strength of that buffalo. I'm cautious and I'm careful around that buffalo because of its size and its, ability to, hurt me. But when you think about men and you think about buffalo, use, this metaphor, the buffalo is very, very steady, right? It moves forward with focus and force, right? Purpose driven. I respect the buffalo, right? And that's what men need. Men need respect. They need space. They need clarity. They don't respond well to constant flitting around and constant interruption and constant changing of mind and rerouting of, that's not how the buffalo is, right? And, there's some other obvious things about a buffalo, right? A buffalo has a thick hide. If you take that same pebble that I mentioned a moment ago that grounded the butterfly, she can't fly anymore. What happens when you put it on, the back of a buffalo? Nothing. He doesn't even notice it's there, right? Because his thick hide is built for resistance, right? He doesn't feel it doesn't penetrate through, right? He's steady and strong and purposeful for a reason, and he was made to carry weight, right? He he's not easily shaken by those same, nuanced changes in the environment that the butterfly is affected by. I mean, he's gotta be able to endure storms and other elements around him. Now, another really key difference about the buffalo is that he's on the ground. He's not flying around, is he, right? His eyes are forward, he's scanning the path in front of him, not the sky, right? You don't see buffalo looking up into the sky. I've never seen that. He's very linear, right? He's moving straight in a straightforward path. He's very solution focused, right? Driven by action and achievement. So while the butterfly senses everything around her, the buffalo is filtering out what's essential and then he moves. He moves with intention and purpose, right? And that large frame, that thick skin, those strong legs, and those big hooves, we might think of those as indications of his insensitivity, but really those are signs of his durability if you think about it in a positive way, right? Sure, he processes slowly and often inwardly. You don't see when you look at a herd of buffalo, you don't see them chatting with each other, right? A buffalo, the human version, he speaks when he has something worth saying, right? His God-given role is to protect and provide, and he presses on even when he's not verbalizing how he feels. My husband just recently took on a part-time job that he has to start at 5 in the morning, and he has to get up at 3:30 because it's about a 40-minute drive to get there. And I try to make sure I tell him every single day how proud I am of him that he is willing to do that. He's not a morning person. He is a night person, but the buffalo in him is willing to do whatever it takes to provide for us. And he presses on even though this is not easy for him. Okay? That's the buffalo in him. So these differences, they're not limitations, right? Think of them instead of like, we talk about love languages. Well, think of this as a type of language, right? And whenever we're trying to understand each other, we can either try to correct each other and say, your way's wrong and my way's right, or we can start to try to really understand it. And when we do that, that's when communication really begins to flow. So let's talk about some common clashes that happen between butterflies and buffalo, okay? So, first of all, the butterfly wants to connect, whereas the buffalo wants to resolve. So we as women, we might say, can we talk about what happened earlier? And what we're really asking for is, I want that emotional connection. But what the buffalo hears is, there's a problem and I need to fix it. So he jumps into solution mode, doesn't he? But we as women, we don't often don't want to fix, right? Instead, what we want is to be heard and just listened to, right? And supported. And that's why so many times I hear women say, "My husband doesn't understand me." And then men say, "I can never do anything right." Right? Another clash is that we as butterflies, we often sense the emotional atmosphere. And whereas the buffalo is reading the room in a logical way. So we can walk into a room and we can sense tension, those slight little emotional shifts or those unspoken things because our radar, our little antenna is just going a mile in a minute, right? So sensitive. But the buffalo may not notice anything's off until, someone actually says it out loud. And that doesn't mean he's ignorant. It's just a different lens through which he sees and processes information. And if we're not careful, we can start blaming each other. We can say, he doesn't care or she's overreacting. I was talking about butterflies communicating in layers. Well, because we don't fly or land in a straight line, right? We flutter, we circle, we pause, hover, we change directions quickly, right? Well, that's how we communicate, right? And our words are often layered with emotion and subtext, right? We don't always say everything that we totally mean, and there it's layered with context. So we might say things like, I feel like we haven't connected lately." But underneath that, there are so many layers, right, to what we're really saying. So we might say what we might not be saying is, "I'm feeling unseen," or "I'm longing for intimacy," or "I'm afraid we're drifting apart." But we're not actually saying those words. Another thing that we do as butterflies is we might circle back around to a topic a number of times, right? And it's not because we're being repetitive, it's because we're trying to peel back those emotional layers because for us, processing is this ongoing thing, right? We're not talking isn't just this linear thing where, I'm transferring information from my brain to yours. No, it's a form of connecting and bonding and sorting things out and creating awareness, self-awareness and other, types of awareness. Um, and we're not always looking for a solution, right? We're metaphorically looking for a space to unfold. So just relax those wings, right? To explore what we're feeling underneath the words. And if we feel rushed or shut down, then that can come across as rejection. And that's something that we often internalize because we are so sensitive, even if that's not what our buffalo husband intended. Jeff and I went on a walk the other day. We do this a lot. And I actually said, "Hey, can we go for a walk?" Because I knew there was something going on inside of me. It wasn't about Jeff or our marriage, but there was something going on inside of me that I needed to process. And I needed to walk for a while before I could finally say, "Hey, can we sit down here so that I can talk this out loud?" It, it was the walking and holding hands and letting Jeff talk for a while that just finally relaxed me inside, allowed those wings to just open up and go, "Okay, I feel ready. I feel ready to share." But I didn't fully know what I wanted to say. I needed to sort of talk it out loud. The buffalo, on the other hand, it communicates in lines, right? What do I mean by that? Well, buffalo are linear, right? So their communication is typically goal-oriented. They say what needs to be said and, what's the clearest, most obvious route, and then we move forward. And once they've addressed something, they can tend to think, "Okay, it's finished," right? There's a beginning and a middle and an end to this, and now this conversation is done. So when we as women circle back around to something that he thought was over and resolved, that can be really confusing for him. Or even worse, it can make him feel like he did a bad job in resolving that problem. Like, he failed. He might think, "Didn't we already talk about this?" Because once the conversation's over and the path forward is really clear, why are we circling back around to this? Why do we need to retrace our steps? Again, the key isn't to try to change either one, but to really recognize and honor these differences. The butterfly doesn't need to become more linear. It's never gonna happen anyway. And the buffalo doesn't need to become more layered, right? They just need to learn how to translate each other's languages because the butterfly speaks in those, I guess we could say poetic layers, and the buffalo speaks in very purposeful lines, and both are valid and both are really, really needed. Okay, another way that they can clash is that butterflies emote as we think and we communicate, right? Whereas buffalo, they tend to think before they emote. This one's pretty huge if you think about it, right? We as women, we're processing eternally or externally is what I mean, right? We're not always, when I say things out loud, it's not always clear to me what I'm really thinking and feeling in the moment. I'm working it out out loud. But a lot of times men, they don't speak until they are certain of what's going on inside of them or how they think and feel about something, right? That can make them feel or seem really emotionally distant to us, right? Really disengaged. But really, that's just an internal process. Um, John Gray writes about this in his book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, when he talks about men needing to go into a cave and to process things internally. It's the same concept, just a different metaphor, right? And we as women can think, "What did I do wrong? He's not talking to me." No, he's processing internally. So how do we take these differences, these potential clashes, and make them work for us instead of against us? Well, we circle back to 1 Peter 3:7, right? Live with understanding. This isn't just about men living with understanding with women, it's vice versa. You have to really look at your spouse and study your spouse like you're a student, trying to understand. So you can ask questions like, "What helps my husband or my wife really feel heard?" Obviously, it's different from me. So what does he or she need to feel connected and supported and encouraged and heard? What shuts them down in conversation? And what can I do when my partner feels disconnected or overwhelmed? And then, of course, that leads to now learn to speak their emotional language. The This doesn't mean you have to become them. If you're a buffalo, you don't have to learn how to, grow wings and fly around or vice versa, learn how to walk on the ground if you're a butterfly. No, it just means you've gotta learn to become fluent in your spouse's needs, right? If you're the butterfly, slow down when he's processing. Give him time to respond to you. If you're the buffalo, don't rush to jump in and give solutions and fix, right? Sometimes just be that placeholder for her to figure it out on her own by listening, by holding her, by nodding at appropriate times and making sympathetic noises and that's it, believe it or not. A lot of times that's all we as butterflies need. And then honor the process, right? Because just because your spouse processes differently doesn't mean they're avoiding, right? Remember, God wired us differently and uniquely, right? So honor that. And then sometimes, I said we were going to talk about this. Sometimes we need to acknowledge that there can be a bit of a reversal, a role reversal here, right? So sometimes butterflies have to become buffalo. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, for example, if the family is going through a crisis and someone has to step up and push through, even even when that's scary, if the buffalo is not leading, if the buffalo is abdicating his responsibilities, let me tell you, men, those of you who are listening, it's not that a butterfly is not capable of doing this. She is, all right? When a woman has to lead and protect and endure, she is totally capable of that. And the opposite is true, okay? A buffalo can sometimes become the butterfly, all right? When he holds his brand new newborn baby for the first time and he tears up, or when he opens up and becomes very vulnerable about something he's experienced in his life that he's never talked about before, right? There are times when buffalo are very capable of that emotional sensitivity and that emotional nuancing. My husband is he's very, very intuitive. He's more intuitive, I would say, than the average man, and he's very nuanced. He has a lot of these butterfly qualities, and that is not I mean, like, that is very attractive to me. That is not a weakness on his part. I see that as very much a strength. So remember, we're not fixed identities. We're not locked into these characteristics. We can carry elements of both of them. And marriage can bring out the best in us, right? It can help us access and appreciate that full spectrum these qualities, both the buffalo and the butterfly qualities that live within us. So as we wrap this up, let's consider this, right? The goal of marriage isn't to make your spouse more like you. Stop doing that. The goal is to appreciate the masterpiece that God has created in both men and women. Butterflies and buffalo were not made to move the same. They were never meant to be that way. They were meant, however, to move together in harmony. Okay, so I'm going to challenge you this week to ask your spouse one simple question. And here it is. What's one way I can better understand you this week? And then your next job is to just listen. Don't jump in and try to fix it or defend what you hear. Just listen. If today's episode moved you in any way, if you connected in any way and you realize that something in you needs to shift or change, please don't ignore that. And remember, healing takes intention. So if there's something broken in your marriage, you don't have to do it alone. My courses, Beauty from Ashes and The Path Less Traveled, both are open now for enrollment, and I designed them to walk with you every step of the way in your healing journey. And for a limited time only, I've slashed $400 off the price of these courses. So now they're both each only $99. Reach out to me to reserve your spot, and I'll get you in. And also be sure to subscribe. Really, please. If you like this content that you're hearing, subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone that you know really needs it. Until next time, stay encouraged and stay intentional. I'll see you next week.